This is Yvette Carnell from Your Black World, and today I'm talking to Pascal Robert, a Haitian blogger who also writes a blog for Black Agenda Report. And what I want to talk about today is racism, coming off of a story that I read and Pascal read from Ta-Nehisi Coates, which was basically kind of a riff off everybody remembers when Forrest Whitaker got patted down in a deli restaurant and somebody thought he stole something and black people all up in arms about he's an Oscar winning actor, blah, blah, blah. And I read that Coates article, and I thought the article was a decent article. But I talked to Pascal, who brought up some things about that article and that way of thinking that kind of changed the way I thought about it. So what I want to do, I just want to allow Pascal to kind of give me his synopsis of that article, and then we'll kind of boil it down to some more specifics. So I think the article was called "Good Racist People," or was it? And it was even though Ta-Nehisi writes for the Atlantic, it was a special piece for the New York Times. And I just want you, Pascal, to kind of give me your initial assessment of that Coates article.
Okay, thanks a lot again, Yvette, for having me on your program. When I read Ta-Nehisi's piece, the Good Racist People, the first reaction I had was that, this is another example of us getting up in arms because a celebrity gets inconvenienced with something that poor black folk and working class black folk deal with every day in their lives, which is basically the normal interaction with racism, whether it's in a professional sphere, a private sphere, or we're dealing with the police. So all of a sudden the world must stop because an Academy Award winning actor who happens to be black deals with a small infraction of racism that becomes a part of most of our lives all the time. I'm sure it's part of Forrest Whitaker's life as well, but the presses must stop because we need to highlight this to show how unjust America is. So off the cuff, my first reaction is that this is another example of suffering of people is evaluated according to the tier of who you are in America. Not to mention the fact that we have thousands of people of color, black and Latino, who deal with these kind of indignities all the time. So that was my first reaction to the article. Secondly, I had read the article after having read another piece by Adolph Reed, again, I know people are tired of me mentioning him, called The Limits of Anti-Racism. And I will admit to you that if I had not read that piece before reading Coates' work, I probably would have had the same reaction that you had, of saying, wow, this is really interesting, this guy's taking racism head on. And then, I really realized, putting this through my mind and thinking is that, where has the 35, 45-year-long conversation on race and racism really gotten us as an American society? Every so on, you hear people say we need to have a conversation about race. We need to talk about race. We don't talk about race enough. I actually make the argument that I believe is that we talk about race too much. But what we don't talk about is economic inequality at all. And how economic inequality is actually how racism and policy are brought together to create the illusion that it is only black folk that are suffering these problems. And as we talked about last week, and my basic definition of racism is that racism is a tool used by the status quo to perpetuate an illusion or to obscure in the minds of whites that they suffer from the status quo agenda, the normal operating of government and private sector initiatives, not only in the same way as black people, but often in larger numbers than black people. So you don't have to worry about, incarceration, or you don't have to worry about the fact that Mitt Romney says 47% of Americans are dependent on the government when you think it's only those brown folk who are depending on those programs, when in reality, over 50% of the people who are receiving those benefits look like you and you happen to be white. There's a problem there. Oh, my gosh. But you don't think that way because the way we frame race and we frame racism in America allows you to constantly see it as a problem of the other. And this is something that the Republican Party plays well on, the otherization of economic oppression. Because they basically say that, you're a hard-working white, Southern American, and, you pay your taxes. You don't want the government to breathe down your neck, even though a large percentage of your population is receiving, social services through welfare and food stamps and Social Security as well. It's those brown people, it's those black people, it's those dark people that are the problem. And this mind game is, basically called a Southern strategy, is a game that conservatives have done effectively to diffuse in the minds of people, particularly white people, that they are suffering from these types of policies that are a function of the way American economics work. In larger numbers, not in a greater portion than black, but in larger numbers than black. I was having a conversation with one of my co-writers for the Black Agenda Report, Bruce Dixon, and he was talking about how many people don't know that in certain parts of the South, whites are being incarcerated at a faster rate than black folk are. He was telling me how it's like, in Illinois, close to Chicago, you go to visit someone in prison, you see, a large, majority of people of color, of black folk, brown folk, And he was like, the first time I went to a facility in Georgia and in parts of the South, I was like, it's all white folk in here. And he started doing research. He was like, the South incarcerates whites at a larger rate than any other part of the country. And yet this is where the bastion of Republican conservatism is. This is the bastion of the Republican Party. And this is where you find, Dixie flag wearing, Southern good old boys who are like, God, guns, and gays, who think that that's what they did is. And they are being demobilized by these policies in larger numbers. That's where you're seeing, right to work laws, where basically you have no unions, you have no union protection. That's where you see, constant economic policies that are damaging the poor and working poor. Yet because of the way the race is framed in America, that it's only those dark folk that deal with that problem, it allows whites to live in this, delusional state that these problems don't face them. And the thing that I saw in Ta-Nehisi's article that, Adolph Reed's piece highlighted is that how the constant concentration on racism or race or how someone treats me bad, I don't like the way those white folk treat me, demobilizes the ability to talk about what is the system that puts you in a position where that white person can look at you as inferior in the first place. What are the economic structures that are causing your community to live in a way where people can look at you as inferior? Is it just that he looks like the way your skin looks, or is it that your skin or your image is attached to a quality of life that is lower than his because of policies that have been put through consistently over time? And as long as you keep talking about how your skin is not being justly treated, as opposed to how those policies created that situation and how those policies affect him in larger numbers than you, then we end up in this kind of verbal circle jerk. We're just talking about racism all the time. We're not the structural
and let me just add one thing to that. When you made that point, this is what initially occurred to me, and this is something that I have found problematic for a very long time. Black people have come to the defense of Barack Obama whenever he's attacked by white racism, by racists on the whites, on the right. And here's the problem with that, as far as I can see, and it kind of ties into what you're saying. Barack Obama is a very rich black man. He's an affluent black man. And the problem is, when you look at Barack Obama, when you look at President Barack Obama, he has a media department, he has Secret Service, he has all these other things. But the minute, Michelle Bachmann or Ted Nugent or any other knucklehead on the right comes out and says something that's even remotely racist, black people rally around this president, regardless of what President Obama has done or has not done. It's as if him being slighted in the slightest way, even if it doesn't impact us in any way, means more to us than black people who are suffering under these structures of these structures of structural racism that create poverty every day. That means more. We got to protect the president, but who cares about the policies that put black people in these situations, these impoverished situations? So this kind of Pavlovian, in a way, the way we react to racism, anytime you attack one of our good black people, our rich black people, our elite black people, we just rally to the scene. It tears away at any sort of kind of mobilization or grassroots movement that we're trying to build, because we feel for whatever reason that we have to protect the rich black person against the knuckleheads. I mean, do you see that tie-in?
Yeah, well, this is a phenomenon that's basically called, linked fate or racial kinship. And linked fate and racial kinship is an illusion. Right? There's no reason why a black man who owns 15 McDonald's chains, who basically is arguing to make sure that we do not increase minimum wage, should have the same political orientation or framing as his employer that works, in the back frying French fries. Why should their politics be the same? Because they have the same complexion? He probably lives in a nice house in the suburbs. He's doing well financially. Everything is great. He wants to make sure he can pay his employees as low a wage as possible. He's not interested in unionizing fast food. He's not interested in giving him health care benefits. He has an employee who is basically, scrounging, working barely minimum wage, a little above that, has no health care, probably doesn't work 40 hours a week. And yet both of them are going to be saying, yeah, we are hope and change. We love Obama. Why are their politics the same? Because they have brown skin? There's no reason their politics should be the same. And this kind of linked fate, racial kinship mentality that comes from this notion that all of us are black folk are sticking together against the man is ridiculous because it's an illusion. What it is, it's an illusion about a construct that is designed to otherize us from the reality that this system comprehensively and collectively works to the disadvantage of working people, laborers, poor people, people on the margins, and people who are not basically given these certain tools to move up in the machine because of their class status in society. And one of the reasons why this particular race discourse, this race speak, is so prevalent and is so ubiquitous in American society is that it avoids us having to talk about class as a society, particularly in the black community. Because think about it. You have someone like a Tim Wise, who's a professional anti-racist. That's what he does. Talking about the problem about racism, how racism is a problem. Do you know what basically stops the Tim Wise industry? A conversation about how class demobilizes the black poor and the black community. You know why? Because he doesn't have the cultural competence to enter that conversation. Because he can't talk about bourgeois Negroes and how they crush black folk with the policy they support. Like in Massachusetts, you had a healthcare a minority African-American healthcare company, nonprofit, that was advocating, and I actually put this on YouTube, and they proudly displayed this YouTube, advocating to have young black males who wear saggy pants, dropping pants, basically charged with criminal offenses. They were proud as a black mental health organization in the state of Massachusetts. They were bragging about the fact that they got the state to implement laws that increase mass incarceration or the capacity to lead to that for young black males.
Well, let me interrupt you. Let me interrupt you right there.
My point. Where does Tim Wise come in that conversation? He can't come in that conversation.
2 points. 2 points. I have never accepted Tim Wise as an authority on anything, and but I'll get to that in a second. But what you just touched on goes into something else, which is the politics of respectability, where some black people, some black organizations get their respect from the dominant class, from the dominant culture, by how willing they are to criticize other black people. So if I say to white people, look, I'm different from these other black people, I can differentiate myself from these other black people, then that kind of pushes me up a notch on the totem pole. Isn't that part of the politics of black respectability?
Of course, that's a linchpin of the politics of respectability, and as we talked about in our last segment, that's something that goes back over 100 years. It goes back to Booker T. Washington. Actually, even Frederick Douglass engaged in that kind of politics. So this is nothing that's alien to the black community, and it's fundamentally designed to make those Negroes who are the genteel, bourgeois, educated class, or those who are well versed in the proper accoutrement of how to function in society to inure themselves or make themselves acceptable to the status quo by saying, I'm not like the rest of those darkies. I'm not you see, they are the problem, and this happens in subtle ways, and it happens in not so subtle ways. And what happens is that you will often find that sometimes that they will sign on to policies that will continue to give them that special status while otherizing and pathologizing and excluding the black poor and the working class from consideration because they are not, in tune with us. Yet these two vastly different parties, one being parasitically damaged by the other, by policy, we all support the Democrats and Obama because they represent us. This is insane. This is ridiculous. What kind kind of group of 4 people aligns their politics with people who are setting a policy that hurts them at times just because they have the same skin color. It doesn't make sense. Well, this is part of the mind game, this kind of way we talk about race, divorced from economic justice, lends itself to something, this article that Professor Reed talks about, the effectiveness of the neoliberal agenda. Now, neoliberalism, as we talked about before, is basically privatization. It's a fancy word to say how the government is selling your government services, like your water, like your police, like your school system, to private corporations while you still pay taxes to more efficiently run those services, yet at the same time cut them if they want to, allocate them in the way they want to, and destabilize the functionality of those services that they want to their profit margin increase as a goal, while you are still paying taxes and getting less services over time. Neoliberalism and privatization, I don't know too many examples across the country that has worked well. It's been a problem for Latin America and South America, but this is the agenda that we have in this country. I mean, Barack Obama is basically, he is the quintessential neoliberal president. We got a privatized healthcare system now with Obamacare. We got privatization of our school system, public schools closing all over America with Race to the Top. So the neoliberal agenda, not only do we have it coming in full force, we all are smiling and clapping our hands and saying, yes, we can, because we have a brown-skinned, smiley-faced man doing it.
Yeah, so but let me bring you back to one point you raised, and I think this is a very important point, and that's why I want to bring it home. In terms of that example you gave of the black McDonald's owner, who owns all these McDonald's but doesn't really have anything in common economically with the people who work for him. And these people, for whatever reason, kind of see themselves aligned because black people, and maybe it's an American thing, but it's definitely a black thing. We tend to live aspirationally. Like if I see a rich person, I say I want to be that person. So I see myself as aligned with that person, even though we don't have economically anything in common. So the question I want to lay out to you is there really anything, is there really any such thing as the black community in terms of shared economic and shared interest? Does that even exist anymore, or is that an antiquated notion? Do we need to shift to class awareness?
Okay, well, my position, and this is, there are some people, Adolf actually makes the argument that the concept of a black community is actually part of the problem because it creates a situation where the discourse about how to handle that community is always laid to the black elite. And that basically, once you start talking about community as a black community, all of the traditional institutions that are claimed to be representative of those communities, and we talked about them, your historically black colleges, your black churches, your fraternal and sorority organizations, which are organizations that are viable and should exist. I'm not arguing that they shouldn't, but what happened is that the black poor and the lower middle class and the working class who don't run those institutions or don't make up the large percentage of them, only less than 20% of blacks go to college anyway, are basically foisting all of their representational capacity on people who make up these three institutions that are a tiny percentage in terms of the overall leadership of the black community. And what that causes to occur is that the policies that are requested inure substantially more benefit to the black elite to the detriment sometimes of the black poor and working class. So to say that there is, as some would say, and some would argue that there is no black community, I would argue that there is a historical, comprehensive reality that black people in America have faced through Jim Crow, through slavery. Yes, that is true. However, that history does not translate into an experiential reality in which black folk are all suffering the same things at the same time. And there's nothing about being black that says that you cannot be sophisticated enough in your politics to make decisions that affect you personally, realizing that there are people in your community that will affect you negatively. Not because they're bad people, because their personal and economic interests are different than yours. But as long as you see yourself as linked to them because you are black and they are black, and you see yourself in this quote-unquote community because you understand we have these institutions, like there are more institutions, like the three I mentioned that are so foundational in the community, you're going to continue to give up your right, your democratic human right to demand of your government and of the system that exists to repair the gulf that has put you in this position. Now people will say, oh, now you're talking about asking the government. I said, listen, did people have a problem asking the government after the Great Depression when the government was implemented the GI Bill? the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Board, that basically are the policies. It was the United States government, after capitalism collapsed in this country, that set forth policy that created the white middle class, that created Italians, Irish, and Jews to be able to launch into American middle class. It was not American capitalism that created America's vast middle class. It was the policy that was created in the face of the failure of American capitalism. By the way, black folk were left out. I know you're reading that book we talked about, When Affirmative Action Was White, which explains how black people were systematically excluded from those government benefits. Anytime you meet a Republican who tell you that government is a problem, ask them, how much was the government a problem after the New Deal, where it basically literally structurally set up the system that allowed our economy to mobilize to create a middle class? People always tell you, oh, it was World War II that got us out of the Depression. Really? If the New Deal didn't create the labor policies that required workers to pay a fair wage and give you an 8-hour workday and do those things, do you think that industrial development that happened after World War II would have created that middle class? Of course not. It was the policies of the New Deal combined with the industrial development that was also, by the way, federally subsidized and bankrolled. Like you had the Work Products Administration, you had people building roads and bridges as well, that caused the growth of this middle class. Black people were left out of that. And now when you tell folk that now you, as a person who is poor, working class, or labor, you should demand of your government policy that changes your situation, people say, oh, y'all need to stop asking the government. Really? Really? Were people saying that when the federal government was giving out land, thousands of acres during the Homestead Act in the 1860s up until the 1970s, particularly the white settlers? Were people saying that when the government was bailing out Wall Street banks that caused $20 to $50 trillion to be eviscerated from the global economy between 2008 and 2013? Or people saying, oh, you can't depend on the government? But when black folk and Latino folk and brown folk saying the government needs to repair this system because we are citizens and human beings and have that right, people look at you funny.
Yeah, well, you don't even have to go back that far. You can look at Wall Street that just got bailed out, and everybody was just like, well, that's just how the system works. No, it's not. So you don't even have to go back that far. But let me just ask you, I want to ask you one more question about the Coates article, because I want to be fair to him, because he did write a subsequent piece where he said, he basically said ghettos were created by policies, and it's not just something that happens and it's going to be undone. That sort of thing is undone by public policy. But here's the question I want to ask about his article in general. And him and the purpose of black writers more specifically. One of the things, and I read the Adolph Reed article. What's the name of the article, just so people will know? It's the limits of limits of anti-racism, I think.
Limits of anti-racism. By Adolph
Okay,
Reed.
so you can just Google that and you can find it. But one of the things I found interesting in terms of, and I call it Negro spotting, or racism spotting, in terms of how we just look for moments of racism and we kind of just hash it out culturally, but nothing's ever done about it. The question I have in terms of the responsibility of people like Coates, who works at a white magazine, but I have to ask the question, is there a responsibility to go further than just saying, yes, this is the consequence of public policy? The one thing that Reed points out is that back in the day when the civil rights struggle happened, the big thing about the civil rights struggle, it wasn't just a fight against racism. It was a fight
against how racism affects black folk.
Exactly, in terms of it was so we had very specific goals. There were very specific goals during the civil rights movement. It wasn't just some broad kind of emotional kind of thing. So do writers who kind of to some extent represent working class people or are put there to kind of espouse or interpret for a white dominant class the plight of black people, working class black people, do they have a responsibility to lay out specific targets in terms of what they feel needs to happen? Or can they just stop short and say, well, there are policies that should be instituted. This was done by policy and it will be undone by policy. Is it good for them to just kind of drop it there and leave it and walk away?
Well, first of all, let's make some point about the civil rights movement. First of all, is that there were different phases of the civil rights movement, and this article talks about that, the limits of anti-racism. If you look at the civil rights movement before World War II, we're talking about the 30s and early 40s, there was always a combination of demand for economic empowerment, jobs, economic policy of the government to mobilize and empower black folk to get them out of poverty, combined with a fight against Jim Crow. So the goal was to neutralize racism and how it affects and allows black folk to suffer disproportionately in terms of poverty and policy.
Absolutely.
Because many of the blacks who were advocating that happened to be affiliated with a political ideology that was noxious to the United States, i.e. communism, socialism, when the World War II was over and the Cold War got into serious motion, that kind of discourse was frozen out. Mm-hmm. Because one of the advantages of the Cold War and McCarthyism is that it stopped black folk from being able to talk about economic justice and, quote unquote, the evil redistribution of wealth, even though it distributes upward all the time. It got people to stop talking about class. It got people to start talking about labor issues and economic issues. Because if you started doing that, you were a pinko, you were a red, you were a commie. And you have to go before the House of American Activities Committee and explain yourself. So this New Deal situation neutralized the economic component of the civil rights movement, which had always existed before. We talked about the Colored Farmers Alliance the other day, which was not purely, but very economic in terms of the demands they were trying to protect the farmers' ability to function. So what happens is that, sadly, because we have media that came of age after World War II, as black people, we romanticize the most ineffective part of the civil rights movement. The part that's just about, we need to get a seat at the lunch counter and we're all marching because we want to just be able to vote. That was actually the weakest and most enfeebled part of the civil rights legacy of the United States. The more radical, if you read the writing of blacks in the 30s, oh my gosh, you think that they're going to burn the house down. They're like, yo, we need jobs, we need policy. I mean, the radicalism of black thinking in the 30s makes the 50s look like a joke. But because that movement was demobilized because of McCarthyism and the Cold War, now we have this all we want. We are appealing to America's conscience to give us the ability to sit down and go to school, sit next to. I used to say, it's funny. The funniest thing about Brown versus Board of Education was to me that you have Thurgood Marshall arguing about how the guy who's considered to be the greatest lawyer in the black community, fighting for the Supreme Court to allow black kids to go to white schools. This guy's a product of black schools his whole life. When I was in law school, I found it kind of comical. I said, you have a man who basically, because of Jim Crow, was a complete product of a black education to the point where he has the skills to go to the Supreme Court and demand that they integrate schools. He's a product of the system that he's saying doesn't work. I was so shocked. I said, how come no one ever brought that up in the argument? I thought it would have been a very interesting question. Now, I'm not saying that and I'm not making the mistake of romanticizing Jim Crow. But what I'm saying is that sometimes when we make demands of the institutions that we have in this society, I always had this debate when I was in law school. I said, how come we didn't just demand better economic funding for schools that were black instead of asking them to integrate in the white schools? This actually, if you do the research, this kind of strategy was discussed. I'm not going to make it seem like they ignored it. There's a long, legal, theoretical explanation as to why that strategy was not pursued. But that actually would have been a much more beneficial posture. Instead of sitting around with this concept of we have these dolls to show how we have the psychological damage of black folk when they see white dolls and all these white people. I said, listen, well, why are we asking for the economic resources to be funneled to black schools equally, if not more so, because of the history of racism, than the white schools? But the thing is, though, because we've stuck, as my last piece talked about, this politics of redemption, that we have to go to white folk and get, approval, and being next to them and rubbing next to them makes us feel better. We have neutralized our movements for justice in a way that, because of political realities like the Cold War and McCarthyism, that are ineffective at addressing the economic realities that are facing not only black people, Latinos, poor whites, and a large segment of this country. And because of the hyper-romanticizing of this period, that we can't talk bad about Dr. King, we can't talk about Malcolm, we don't realize that this was actually one of the most politically demobilizing periods of the black liberation struggle, freedom movement in this country. We don't talk about that because, again, we don't really look at the history in that context. And as a result, we end up, and I want to get to your question about Ta-Nehisi Coates, about does he have a responsibility? I don't believe this notion that just because you're black, you have a responsibility to represent us. This is why I have a problem with that. because it's counterintuitive that what I'm saying about this linked fate concept that, he's black and he has a job. I would rather Ta-Nehisi Coates represent his personal experiences. The problem is, the same way I'm saying that I shouldn't require him to represent black folk, is that sadly, the institutions use him to represent black folk, and not just him, it's not him, use these media figures, but do so in a way that is not as effective and is not clear to address the problem. So we have this kind of feel-good discourse about racism, that these guys can go into their offices at the New York Times or the Atlantic and rub arms with their quote-unquote non-racist, white liberal, bohemian friends, their hipster friends. Yeah, Ta-Nehisi, that was a great article, man. That was awesome, dude. Yeah, man. They put on some Tupac, man. I'm telling you, it was awesome. You remind me when I was an undergrad, there was this guy named Shaquille. We used to talk. Yeah, I mean, that kind of nonsense basically ends up creating this air in the room that something is really getting done, but nothing is getting done. So I would not say that that more responsibility is on him or anyone else to represent the black community effectively. What I'm saying is that we need to represent ourselves and realize that these people are not made to represent us.
So really the problem isn't necessarily that he's supposed to represent black people or working class black people or black people of a certain class. The problem really and the danger is that, and I respect Ta-Nehisi a lot. I'm not saying that, but I'm speaking more broadly here. The problem is that a lot of black writers who are on the forefront are interpreted by white people as representing the majority interest of black people. And is that what you're saying is the issue?
Tour guides.
Oh.
Yeah, they are cultural tour guides. Like, yes, let me show you what's going on in the hood. And today we have Tariq who's sitting there with the crack vial next to him. Yeah. And this is his sister who's in her 9th month. This is her second child born out of wedlock. So they're the cultural tour guides to black dysfunction. By the way, some of these Negroes have lived in nice suburbs, some are on Martha's Vineyard, sip tea and crackers, and have no understanding, no organic connection to these communities. But they are the cultural tour guides for what's going on for the black community, and they interpret what is considered legitimate or illegitimate in policy that the government doles out. Like, yes, black people will benefit from Obamacare. What about the fact that there's been recently found a glitch in Obamacare that may literally alienate millions of poor folk? Oh my! Whatever happened to that spiel about Obamacare being such a benefit? You see what I'm saying? So, race to the top. We all, racist. Well, how about the fact that public schools across the country are being shut down in numbers I've never seen in my life? So
Chicago most recently, just last week.
So what I'm saying is that when you have these Negroes in these positions where basically they are elite themselves, they're educated, or at least they're educated enough to be in those circles, they mesh their worldview. Their policy thinking comes from the whites that work with them. Whether they're conservative or liberal, they're all down with the same noxious agenda. So they end up echoing support for things that are completely to the detriment of the working class poor, the guy who's a bus driver who has a union he's worried about, or the guy who basically, a teacher who's worried about her job, or the brother in the corner who's worried about what's going on with the cops. They are in a position where they are negotiating against the interests of the black community. So my position is not that we should demand that they represent us better. My position is that we need to be educated enough to not depend on them and to call them out for how poor they do a job of representing us, and that we don't want them representing us at all. That their functionality is to the benefit of the status quo, is to the benefit of the establishment. None of these people are talking about what needs to be done to address not just the black community, but poor people, working people, because they are too worried about being able to sit down and say, I met with the president, whether he's Obama, Bush, or Clinton, or whatever else. Toni Morrison, you're like, Bill Clinton is the first black president. Did you feel that way when he destroyed AFDC, the aid to the Families Defended Children, the state welfare program that the federal government had? Did you say that when he was talking about Sister Soldier, that he's the first black president? But this is the position we're in now, when we feel that our priority as elite Negroes is to sit down and be able to say, I had dinner with Bill Clinton at a vineyard. It was wonderful. It was great.
And here's my issue, and this is where my head explodes, honestly. I can sit down and say, the first time I read the Ta-Nehisi Coates article, I read his follow-up post on the Atlantic. I think he had a couple of follow-up posts that kind of related to that subject, and I thought they were both pretty good kind of outlays of kind of the racial interactions or whatever in terms of his observations. But my issue comes in, and I say this, I listen to this guy when he says this about, racism, and it has to be undone by policy. And I hear him say that. I hear Ta-Nehisi Coates say that, that the ghettoization of America in terms of black people was done by public policy, and it's going to have to be undone by public policy. That's what he said. And then on the other side, I think to myself that this guy is still like a huge Obama supporter. How do those two things mesh? And then when
I want to take the conversation beyond Obama, because as much as he creates a distraction to what the problems are deeper than him. They were here before him.
Of course.
He's just used as an effective image to enable the problems working to a better. The oppression is just better because we have a face that neutralizes us. This is not it's not. We don't need to become fixated on Obama.
Well, the oppression is perceived. The oppression is perceived as being better. It's never. It's certainly not better. Right. But you're right. It's certainly perceived.
Perception, right? No. In other words, it's a shell game. It's a perception that he makes things better when actually the agenda is to make it get worse faster and more efficiently. Mm-hmm. So in that way, you are right that we need to highlight what his administration does because of that reality. But we have to understand that these are realities that existed before him, and hopefully they don't exist after him. It's that he's just an effective enabler of that machine. And to say that the point with Ta-Nehisi Coates is him being an Obama supporter is not as much the issue for me. It's that when he says that we need to have policy to end racism, that's a perfect example of a statement to me that's useless. You know why? I'll tell you why. If we ended racism today in America, I mean literally ending, where white folks stopped making decisions based on how the color of your skin looked, would that functionally change the relationship between the majority of black folk and the way this economy functions? Really? Would it really?
Because it's still a capitalistic economy, and tomorrow, if nobody has any race consciousness, the black people are still disproportionately in poverty.
If you end racism, poor black folks still have poor education. Poor black folks still live in the hood. Poor black folks still, because of structural problems, are committing crimes that basically cause them to they may not get racially profiled, but they're still going to get arrested more because the drugs are in the hood. All these things are in the hood. So, in other words, ending racism, which is what Coates advocates, doesn't change the situation, except for a small group of people. Guess who? The black elite. Because now those little barriers and slights at their jobs, which is the kind of racism we're always worried about, job discrimination, employment discrimination, which affects black people overall. But these kind of things are more problematic and more angering, like affirmative action, are more problematic for educated Negroes who had the resources and the capacity to excel anyway. Anyway. How many times do you hear black folk in the hood talking about, I'm so mad that I got treated badly by the storekeeper? He doesn't care about that crap. He cares about the fact that he got 5-0 coming down the street, knocking him up, and that he got some kids shooting guns, and his little brother.
And should we be, like, the question I always ask is, should you be upset if a storekeeper doesn't treat you as kindly or as nicely as the white person? This idea that we should somehow be beholden to how white people treat us emotionally, that should cause us some sort of angst if a white person, doesn't like us is sort of problematic. I don't really, this sort of reactionary thing.
I don't think that anyone should surrender the right to be offended by bad treatment. In other words, I don't think that you should surrender the right to be offended by bad treatment just because you're black or Latino.
But at what level? Hold on, here's the thing. Even if a black person treats me in a certain way, I can be offended. I was treated badly. But does it rise to the point to where we're writing articles about being disliked? Now, I'm not talking about the Forrest Whitaker thing because they did pat him down.
Now we're in a different situation, because now what happens is that you are sucking the energy out of the room. You are becoming, what you also do, you're demobilizing any political addressing of policy and what can be done to remedy the situation. And you're also what you're doing is that you're creating an era of what I call feel-good politics. We can feel good because we talked about racism today. And we had a visual, and we held hands, we lit candles, we sang "We Shall Overcome." We want racism to go away, and tomorrow we can go back to watching charter schools eviscerate public education and feel good. As long as we have more black folk who are at the levels of the death machine and the Death Star that's grinding us to powder, and diversity is on the rise, everything's great. And that's one of the problems with neoliberalism. Again, neoliberalism, the privatization of everything, is that neoliberalism creates this notion that the market is fine, the market is justice. The way the market works is great. As long as we have more black folk who are at the top of the machine benefiting from the market, there's no problem. Oh, really? The market just took $20 to $50 trillion of global wealth out of the world economy. We now have banks in Cyprus that are saying we have to tap into your checking account, your savings account, to bail out banks. And the market is working well. Capitalism was working well. A banker in Italy said the other day, we need to take 15% out of your savings account to bail out banks. Really? The market is working well? Is it really? Capitalism is doing wonderful? And trust me, I'm not a capitalist, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a socialist. We had this conversation. I don't believe in the viability of any of these Western financial systems because they all allow the core root of the problem, which is interest-based banking. That's a whole other conversation. We can get into that in a while. But the bank, as long as you don't change the banking system in any country, whether it's America, Russia, communist Europe, you're going to have this kind of parasitic kind of economic structure. Because that paradigm, interest-based lending, is what leads to these type of inequalities. And all those systems allow it. It's just basically moving the deck chairs on one end of the Titanic to the other end. Who's sitting in the sun one day and who's sitting in the shade? If we don't address the way our money functions in this society as an economic institution in terms of interest, trading, commerce, the value of currency. These are deeper conversations that are off the top of what we're talking about right now. No matter what system, whether it's communism, socialism, capitalism, whatever ism you want to talk about, is not going to have a dramatic change in creating economic justice in the world. It will create an illusion of economic justice, but at some point there will still be that calcification of wealth and power, either in a capitalist society, private corporations. In a socialist society, you still have private corporations. In a communist society, you have it in government. The people who run the government, they get the benefits. So we have to really start thinking outside the box about how we look at ourselves relative to our economics. And the sad reality is you and I are having this conversation at this level. No one's talking like this. These kind of conversations don't exist. They happen in small circles of people who are thinking and asking these questions. How come we're only given these three options? Capitalism, socialism, communism. Why? Who said that? What about cooperative economics? How about the public owns 30% of Microsoft, the government owns 30% of Microsoft, and the private sector, the private owners own 30%. How about a cooperative system? Anyone think about that? With no interest. With an economic system that's based on equity-based lending. Oh, that's an interesting concept. We don't talk like that. Why not? Because we're stuck in these models that the
left-right, the false left-right paradigm. This kind of false. You're either Democrat or Republican.
Kind of this, that, one or the other. That we're stuck in that demobilizes us because, we're too busy watching Real Housewives of Atlanta instead of reading a book. And that's all of us. It's not just black folk. This is all of us. We all have our little, addictions to popular culture. I might be basketball, I may be whatever else. But these things are designed to disable us from asking questions about the system. We entertain ourselves to death and destruction and poverty because we're not asking questions about how this system works. So there are deeper problems here. For us to pick on Ta-Nehisi Coates is not fair to him because this is a guy who thinks he's doing the right thing. I'm sure he cares sincerely and deeply about the black community, and I don't think he's doing a bad job. He's not hired. Hold on a second. He's not hired to do the work that we as a community, and I'm not talking about we as elite bloggers or writers. I'm talking about we as black folk who live in the community, the working class, the laborer, the poor folk, the brother in the hood. We have to get the political education ourselves to mobilize ourselves to address these issues.
And we have to, and this is something that we have to also, and I'm not picking on Ta-Nehisi either. Let me just, because here's the thing. We have to teach ourselves, but we also have to kind of put it out there, and we have to have our own mediums, because the thing we have to share with people is Ta-Nehisi's experience is one experience. He's giving you his experience, and that's very valuable, and I'm sure he's interpreting it to the best of his ability, but there are 10,000, there's so many other experiences. For every black person, we have very different experiences. He comes from one experience. That's his experience, and that's his interpretation, and he puts that out there, and that's fine. He projects respects that, and that's what he does. But what we have to get out there is that there are no, there is no black representative. He is not interpreting blackness for white people. That's not how it should be interpreted. That's not how people should look at it. The idea that we have 4 or 5 black people, in media who kind of, do the interpreting for us. And this really came of age in the era of Obama, in terms of where white people were kind of looking to black people too in terms of interpretation. So, and I'm not talking about that in a bad way. It's not a negative thing for me. But I want people to understand that this is, first of all, not an attack on Coates in terms of, he did a very bad thing. I enjoyed his piece, and I said that in the beginning. But I think we should just kind of tamp it down in terms of trying to put him in a position, or any other black writer for that matter, as the authoritative, speaker for the black community, which I think even on an unconscious level, a lot of people tend to do when they read something that's well written. You're so articulate by a black person.
Well, I would argue that, to be fair, that this did not just start in the age of Obama. This was going on in the 80s. What do you think Thomas Sowell was? What do you think these black conservatives, they do the same thing, but on the right. They do the same thing. They are the right-wing cultural tour guides of how can we promote how can we get black folk to sign on to charter schools? But charter schools started as a conservative movement. Thomas Sowell was one of the first advocates of charter schools. Mm-hmm. How do we get black folk to agree to privatize their Social Security, Tom? How do we get to that? Well, let me tell you, we can go in the hood and get your mom and tell them, hey, these things. This is not something that is done only on the left or in the Democratic Party. This is done by the left, by the right, and it's before Obama. And Obama does it. The reality is that in the Obama age, it becomes more damaging only because his racial narrative neutralizes.
Exactly. That's my point.
It neutralizes. He's like an anesthesia to the minds of black folk and liberal folk who feel good. That look, we have a black president. Things are better. I mean, I wrote in the last piece I did, the politics of redemption and the black leadership revisited. There's a quote by Henry Louis Gates where he talks about the day Obama won the election in 2008. We cheered, we screamed, we roared. Finally, a man who will come and not only redeem black people, but redeem America's 400-year history of racism. I'm like, are you serious? What was he smoking that day? I said, so you are basically saying that this one person who has not done a blip of policy yet, by his sheer presence there, brings the manna from heaven and the holy water just falls out of the sky, and everyone's cured, and everything's wonderful, and the deer and the lamb and the lion will lay down, and that's ridiculous. And this is the danger of having this class of individuals be the quote-unquote representative, the cultural tour guide for the black community, because they sign on to agendas that are damaging to poor folk, working folk, black folk, people, women, everyone who is not in that elite tier, sitting down making negotiations like, we need Obama to get a grand bargain. Really? Do you understand what you're saying when you say the grand bargain is the political consensus in Washington? Are you joking me? So you're going to tell me that we're going to allow the first president in American history to cut Social Security, one of the most successful social programs we've had in this country, because he needs to get a grand bargain? Are you joking me? It's ridiculous. But this is the conversation because these people are all elites. And elites set up policy and make arguments that benefit them. That's the bottom line. So this is not just about black elite. This is about the fact that the elites need to be basically dislodged from the position where they are representing our interests, because they don't. They represent their own interests, and they're grounding the rest of us to dust in the process. The sad reality is in the black community, there are so few elites, and it is more of us who can get ground to dust, that those few elites basically sign on to things that have a more detrimental effect on the community.
Well, and I'm going to wrap it up in a second, but we gladly sign on to it. This is something I mentioned earlier because of, being so aspirational. You can show us Oprah, you can show us Magic Johnson, and you can say, wow, look at these people they have achieved. So since they're in favor of whatever administration, it doesn't really matter what administration was. Could be the previous administration, could be the current administration. If they're in favor of this XYZ policy, then it must not be to my detriment, because that person comes from, quote unquote, the black community.
Oh, this is a great book I just got on Oprah Winfrey. I mean, I forgot the full title. It's basically about Oprah Winfrey, something in the neoliberal age. Now, basically, Oprah Winfrey is the perfect poster child to be the gatekeeper to this neoliberal privatization for the status quo. She encourages consumerism. She'll support all kinds of policies. She'll support these Obama, Cory Booker type politicians who want to ground you to dust with this neoliberal policy. And she'll make you feel good at the same time because you're like reading Oprah's book club. So, these Negroes are all, they represent their interests. They like to sit around and rub elbows with the same people who are, running the Death Star to the ground for all of us. And that's what they do. But that doesn't mean that we need to basically fall asleep and allow them to get away with that. We have to educate ourselves. We have to educate our communities. We have to educate the brothers and sisters in the hood. We have to educate the brothers and sisters in the barrio. We have to educate the brothers and sisters who are, in Appalachia, who are the laborers who are working in Michigan, the working class folk, white, black, other, to let them know that, listen, the time of giving up our power to these folk is over, and we have to be able to make demands that represent our interests on the institutions that we live here for, to pay taxes to, and that we contribute to one way or the other, and make sure that we are not abused in the way that we have been, particularly in the last 35 to 40 years.
Well, that's a perfect way to close it out for today. I want to thank you for this conversation. I think Pascal and I have agreed to do this once a week. So every Monday, at Your Black World, you can check out our conversations, and I will also link to Pascal's blog, so you can check out what he has to say. And Pascal, I'll see you next week.
All right. Talk to you later.
All right.